Hello, today I'm going to talk about my top 10 occult fantasy films. There will be some Gnostic elements here and there as well. When deciding on these films, I balanced the occult elements with how entertaining they were. That's how I created the hierarchy. I'm going to focus primarily on occult, alchemy, and Gnostic points of view here. I'm going to start with a few that did not make the list. The first is Black Death, which I thought was a pretty cool movie for what it is. And then The Green Knight, visually spectacular, but I think many of the other films here top it. And also The Northman. I'm a big Robert Eggers fan, and I like The Northman, but I definitely think the other films here top it. So at number 10 we have Doctor Strange from 2016, directed by Scott Dickerson, starring Benedict Cumberbatch, Rachel McAdams, and Mads Mikkelsen. Dr. Stephen Strange, a talented but arrogant neurosurgeon, seeks healing after a car accident ruins his hands. He becomes a powerful sorcerer, learning the mystic arts and defending Earth from mystical threats in a battle for cosmic balance. The thing to say first is that this movie is about magic. I mean, you couldn't get more occult than that. It is a Marvel film, and I'm not a huge fan. I mean, I like certain ones. Winter Soldier is a good one, and Civil War was okay. There's a few I like, but this one I think is unique. It shows the manipulation of mystical energies, alternate dimensions, initiation into occult practices, spiritual journey through esoteric knowledge. There are a lot of ritualistic elements, astral projection and magical sigils. I think in many ways it does a good job at articulating in a visual manner, not just the magic part, but the altered consciousness, journeying through different modes of consciousness. I think that is done very well here. It's not the best Marvel film, but it's certainly the most occult. And I will say, if you've ever read any of the comics, I read some of them when I was a kid, it's super occult, the comics are, so you should check them out. Number 9, we have Krull from 1983, directed by Peter Yates, starring Ken Marshall, Lizette Anthony, Freddie Jones, Liam Neeson, and Robbie Coltrane. A prince embarks on a perilous journey to rescue his bride, who has been kidnapped by the malevolent ruler of the shifting Black Fortress. With the help of a mystical weapon called the Glaive and a band of unlikely allies, the prince battles dark forces and fulfills a prophecy destined to bring peace to their world. I adored this movie when I was a kid. With the success of Star Wars, there were all these fantasy films that came out, like hundreds of them. And this was one of the more, I'd say, minor ones. I don't know, there's something about it that really spoke to me when I was a child. The fantasy aspects of it stimulated my imagination. As far as occultism is concerned, the Glaive is a 5-bladed throwing star with mystical properties. You can imagine that the pentagram signifies protection or elemental balance. So that's a very hefty symbol here. The prince's retrieval of the Glaive from a fiery mountain is an initiatory rite. And there's this black fortress that shifts locations daily, sort of symbolizing chaos and instability. It's got a labyrinthine design. I just think it's an interesting idea that the villain's fortress moves, which makes it interesting. I think the beast in this, the villain, is an occult representation of the demiurge. The seer is an occult visionary. He foresees destiny like justice. There are a lot of great characters in this, minor ones and major ones, but one I particularly like is the Widow of the Web, and this kind of symbolizes fate and the cosmic web. There are 8 sides of the chaos star and chaos magic, 8 legs in the spider. I also like the fire mares, and they can even fly in the sky. They're these magical steeds. Then there's this magical wedding, which kind of symbolizes the alchemical marriage, the Hyros, Gamos, or sacred union. And yeah, at a very fundamental level, I think it draws a lot from Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, just like Star Wars does. It's a great film, and if you like kind of high fantasy, I think the effects are pretty good for the time, actually. There's a lot of matte paintings and stuff, which I'm a big fan of. At number 8, we have Labyrinth from 1986, directed by Jim Henson, starring Jennifer Connelly, David Bowie, and Frank Oz. Sarah, a young girl, embarks on a magical journey to rescue her baby brother from the Goblin King, navigating a labyrinth filled with strange creatures and traps. Along the way, she learns important lessons about maturity, identity, and self-reliance. The Labyrinth is a classic symbol of occult journeys. It's a psychological and spiritual process of confronting the inner self, and it's also the solving of a puzzle, which I think occultism is. The further down the rabbit hole I've gone into it, the more I realize that it's a puzzle that keeps kind of changing its solution the deeper I go into it, which I think fits with this movie quite well. The Goblin King embodies a dark, mystical force. Bowie had a song called Quicksand, and it talks about Crowley and the Golden Dawn, and it's highly occult. Here, he's basically the magician. There are occult themes of temptation, illusion, and inner transformation. There are a lot of alchemical symbols in this film too, and it's just the search for personal power. This and the next film on the list, I think, are masterpieces in terms of their execution. You know, dealing with puppets, I think, is just a really hard thing to do. It's quite successful here. The next film is even more successful. At number 7, we have The Dark Crystal from 1982, directed by Jim Henson and Frank Oz, starring Jim Henson, Frank Oz, and Jerry Nelson. In a mystical world, the Skeksis and the Mystics, two factions of a divided race, fight for control of the Crystal of Truth. A young gelfling named Jen embarks on a quest to heal the crystal, restore balance, and reunite the divided factions. So obviously crystals are very occult, but in this film in particular, they symbolize cosmic power. The duality between the Skeksis and the Mystics reflects the balance of light and dark. They are opposing energies that must be reconciled for spiritual harmony. And if you've seen the film, you know how the two opposing forces are sublimated. There's a kind of spiritual healing going on, not just in the crystal, but also the two halves of these beings that have been split apart. There's obviously the quest for knowledge and cosmic insight, and it's a great film. There is no film like it, really, in my opinion. It is the highest standard or pinnacle of puppetry, I would say. It's just filled with imagination. Brian Froud, I don't know how you pronounce his name, he designed most of the creatures, and it's just really cool. At number 6, we have Raiders of the Lost Ark from 1981, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Harrison Ford, Karen Allen, and Paul Freeman. Indiana Jones embarks on a perilous journey to find the biblical Ark of the Covenant, a sacred artifact of immense power before the Nazis can claim it. Along the way, he faces ancient traps, rivals, and supernatural forces tied to the Ark's divine power. Most people consider this an action film, but I disagree. I actually think that this is a fantasy film wearing an action film's veneer. The first thing is that it is loaded with occult references. If you know anything about Hitler, he had an obsession with the occult. You can look up Vril energy. There was the Nazi obsession with the Ark as a conduit to gain power. And at the end of the film, there's the supernatural destruction of the Nazis because they're messing with these occult powers they didn't understand. But I think that's something that, you know, at least in my own life, like when I first got into the occult, you know, many people were, oh, you're going to go mad, or, you know, there's this kind of idea that these arcane and mystical powers are tied to symbols or artifacts or, you know, kind of curses or demons or all these things. I'm not discounting the possibility of all that, but truly think that the occult is more of a psychological examination. And like I said earlier, it's kind of a puzzle to solve. And so the more kind of demonic, lose your mind stuff, I suppose it's possible. I haven't yet. And I've been pretty deep into it for a long time. With that said, you know, I do think that there are dangers, and I think that it is easy to get lost in it because it is such a big paradox and puzzle. The Ark of the Covenant in this is a symbol of divine judgment. I'm not sure if people see it this way, but for me, I feel like Indiana Jones is a bit like John Constantine. He's an occult detective that kind of gets in over his head often, and he doesn't really believe the stuff, but by the end of each movie, he obviously has his eyes opened. And yeah, in the end, I think this is a fantasy film. At number 5, we have Star Wars from 1977, directed by George Lucas, starring Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher. A young farm boy, Luke Skywalker, learns about the mystical force and joins a rebellion to battle an evil empire. With the guidance of mentors, Luke embarks on a journey of self-discovery, battling both physical and spiritual forces. I'm specifically going to be talking about the first film, Star Wars: A New Hope, but a lot of this could be applied to the whole series, I suppose. The Force is a metaphysical energy field, and there's a light and a dark side, which represents duality. If you think of the Jedi and the Sith, they are black and white magic. There's kind of a Gnostic dualism to them. One side is focused wholly on the material. They are kind of the Hylic, the Sith. And then the other, the Jedi, are more like the Punamatic. They are highly spiritual and selfless. There are so many occult powers in these films. Mind control, telekinesis, energy manipulation. There's esoteric knowledge. In Attack of the Clones, he goes to the Jedi library. There's all this, knowledge from thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. There is this focus on dreams and visions, not so much in Star Wars, but especially in The Empire Strikes Back and the prequels. A lot of their actions are defined by their prophetic dreams. And then, of course, there's the symbol of Excalibur. There is Eastern occult practices like Taoism and Zen involved here. You could even see Anakin's fall to the dark side as the alchemical transformation of the Phoenix, literally dying in fire and being reborn as Darth Vader. And then in Return of the Jedi, being redeemed by his son, which would be in turn another alchemical process. When the Jedi die, they become one with the living force. So there's a type of transcendence. They transcend the material world. They still exist, but they are more than that. At number 4, we have Excalibur from 1981, directed by John Boorman, starring Nigel Terry, Helen Mirren, and Nicole Williamson. A mystical retelling of the Arthurian legend, Excalibur explores King Arthur's rise to power, his relationship with the wizard Merlin, and the magic of the sword Excalibur. The film intertwines prophecy, fate, and supernatural forces, culminating in a battle between good and evil. I didn't really take this into consideration when I was picking these films, but the 1980s was kind of the benchmark of fantasy. All of the really great films came out in the 1980s, so like many of these came out in the 80s, but this one, yeah, when I saw it when I was a kid, there was something kind of sensual and sexy about it, more than it should have been for what it was. If you've seen the film, you know Helen Mirren is quite hot in the movie. But there's also this kind of underlying sensuality to the whole thing. Even the violence is sensual too. You know, the part with the spear and he's kind of getting pulled in, that's kind of like almost penetrative. You know, it's kind of a weird movie in that way. But, you know, it focuses on Arthurian magic, Merlin and Morgana. Like Star Wars, Excalibur represents divine power, and there's the quest to wield it, self-discovery, transformation, and the mastery of magical forces. Not just by the wizards and witches, but also to some degree by the knights. They go through their own kind of initiations, and there is this element of fate that's very heavy in the movie. There are themes of reincarnation, destiny, and divine intervention, the cyclical nature of existence, the intervention of spiritual entities. Merlin is a lot like Gandalf, almost a demigod in some ways, and he keeps everything kind of balanced. I think the Grail myth is quite fascinating, the Knights Templar and all that stuff. I mean, the Grail is the symbol of the Eucharist. Some people have it linked to the fly agaric mushroom. There are many books on this if you want to check them out, but I think it's a very interesting idea. At number 3, we have Dune from 1984, directed by David Lynch, starring Kyle MacLachlan, Sean Young, and Max von Sydow. In a distant future, Paul Atreides becomes embroiled in political intrigue over control of the desert planet Arrakis, the sole source of the spice melange. As Paul embraces his destiny, he unlocks mystical abilities tied to an ancient order and begins to understand his role in a greater cosmic plan. Now, I could have chose the Villeneuve films, but I chose the Lynch one because I think it explores the occult a little bit more than the other films. And in some ways, I think it's closer to the books. Now, I like the Villeneuve films for the spectacle and everything, but I think I prefer the Lynch film for its adaptation, even though it's quite abbreviated as far as its running time. I wish it was longer. I know there's a director's cut out there somewhere that maybe will never be released, but we can hope. So, like many of the other films on this list, there's the manipulation of spiritual power. Like the Jedi, there's the Bene Gesserit mystics, and also the mystics from Dark Crystal. They're all kind of similar. In Dune, I feel like they're a little bit more, I don't want to say they're nefarious, but their agendas are not always positive. They're kind of meddling in everything, and they're not, I think in Star Wars they're much more light and dark. There's lots of ritual and esoteric influences here. The Bene Gesserit have access to hidden occult powers that they in turn teach to Paul Atreides. There's a lot in here about altered states. Melange could be, compared to psychedelic trips with mushrooms or LSD or ergot or something. In the Eleusis Rites, they talk about this drink, the kekyon, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a drink that has milk and honey and ergot and a few other things in it. It's claimed that's what they tripped out when they were doing these rituals. There's a strong focus on prophecy and fate and the existence of an unseen spiritual hierarchy, and also predestination. He is kind of touted as the Messiah. In the third book, he is the Messiah. He's not a hero, and you could say his embracing of the occult is almost his downfall in some ways. The more powerful he becomes, the more likely it is that everything's just going to go to shit, really. And it does. At number 2, we have Conan the Barbarian from 1982, directed by John Milius, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, James Earl Jones, and Max von Sydow. Conan, a warrior driven by vengeance after his family is slaughtered, embarks on a quest to stop the rise of the evil sorcerer Thulsa Doom, who leads a cult worshipping a snake god. Along the way, Conan learns about the mystical forces at play and confronts the dark sorcery threatening the world. Of all the films on here, this has the best cult leader or cult figure, and that's Thulsa Doom, played by James Earl Jones. He is amazing in this film. When I was a child and I saw this, I shouldn't have seen it, but I did. This became probably one of my favorite movies of all time. Thulsa Doom is an interesting character because he's supposed to be this, he wears a mask, and what I mean is the face you see in the film is not his true face. John Milius has even said that he's supposed to represent this kind of nearly extinct species. That's why he can transform into a snake and everything. But there's a lot tied to his cult. The snake worshipping and the Ouroboros symbol, the ritual sacrifice and the worship of dark deities, blood sacrifices to their god Set, this kind of ancient sorcery that goes back really far into antiquity that he is kind of carrying forth. Again, like many of the other films, destiny, there's this kind of spiritual fortitude that Conan has where he can counter anything that's kind of pushed on him or challenges him. And I think that goes back to alchemy a little bit, because you need spiritual strength to get through these ordeals, and he has it. I know people often see him as a character, the barbarian, as this kind of lout, this kind of primitive person, but if you've read the books, you know he's highly intelligent and quite creative and pretty crafty. I think they did a good job in this film of translating that. This sounds funny, but I actually think this might be Arnold's most cerebral film. There is the manipulation of life and death, both on the good side and the evil side. In the case of Thulsa Doom, he's trying to live forever. In the case of Conan, he goes through a kind of Christ-like resurrection. There's also this idea of lineage and the passing on of knowledge. And Conan's sword, his father's sword, and the riddle of steel, I think, play into this a lot. I think Oliver Stone's script, which was also rewritten by John Milius, draws heavily upon Robert E. Howard, Persian, Greek, and Norse traditions, Nietzsche, occultism and mysticism, and The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. And I think all of those topics examine the occult. So like, I just think this film, one reason why I have it at number 2 is there's so much in it. If you watch it and you know anything about the occult, it's just pouring out of every seam of the film. And it's an amazing film. It's one of my favorites. At number 1, we have Lord of the Rings, the entire trilogy, 2001 to 2003, directed by Peter Jackson, starring Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, and Viggo Mortensen. Frodo Baggins and a fellowship of allies set out to destroy the One Ring, a powerful artifact capable of corrupting those who seek to control it, in an effort to prevent the Dark Lord Sauron from conquering Middle-earth. The journey leads them into a world of ancient magic, powerful entities, and a battle between good and evil. People often comment on how the story is just Tolkien's experiences in the war. I don't discount that, and I definitely think that is a big part of this film. But I also think there's a kind of Christian mysticism in this film that people overlook often. And there are many, many occult symbols here. I mean, the One Ring represents many things. It represents eternity, union, dominion, power, commitment, and enslavement. So it's a very potent symbol here. I think the greatest lesson in this trilogy of films and the books is the temptation of power and the corruption that ensues from that, which is a very occult aspect. I know this, that in my time studying it, which has been more than 20 years, there have been temptations to abuse the power. And I think when I first started it, that was something that was very seductive about it. I do think that I've gained some control over my impulses. And you know, you can see that playing out in these films. Some people can't deal with the ring. It's just too much power and they don't have the will to combat it, the influence of it. And then there are others like Frodo and Bilbo that even though they are not consumed the way the others would be, they still have the effects from it, the kind of detrimental effects. You can't really talk about this without Gandalf and Saruman. They're the archetypes of the wise sorcerers, the magicians. They are kind of the occult battle between light and dark in some ways. They're opposites, even though at the beginning of the film they're supposed to be on the same side. But again, that shows kind of the temptation of what it can do. There's the Palantir, the Seeing Stones, which, if you know anything about scrying, they're kind of scrying device. I would look into John Dee or Edward Kelly if you want to know more about scrying. The Ents and the Elves have this mystical connection with nature. In mirroring the Excalibur myth, Aragorn has his Arthurian lineage, and there's the Tree of Gondor, which is like Yggdrasil. Tolkien was fascinated with languages and also ancient runes, and that is on full display in these films. But let's get to the main thing here, and I think that's Sauron. He is the Lord of the Rings, which is another name for Saturn, which is another name for Satan. You could also say Demiurge. Middle Earth is a fallen world. In the last video I did on Gnostic archetypes and the tripartite division, I talk about how there are actually three worlds the tripartite cosmos. It says right in the name, Middle Earth. That's the middle world. The Eye of Sauron is the fire of the will. It's dominion. Saturn is also Father Time. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things where you could connect it with the black cube of Saturn and Saturn worshipping and everything else. Now, I'm not saying that Tolkien was involved with that. I mean, he was a Christian, so I doubt it. But aside from Sauron, I think the most important thing about these films is the corruption. You have characters like the Ringwraiths, the Nazgul, who were corrupted by the power, the occult power. Saruman, who too deeply studied the mind of the enemy. The dwarves delved too deep into the mines of Moria, unleashing sort of a demonic Balrog. Yeah, I mean, you could go on and on. You know, the Ring, it just sums it up. It's everything, it's all of it. It's all of the occultism put into one small symbol, I think. But that's all I got for this video. If there's any other films that you think should be on here, or if you disagree with my choices, you can put those in the comments. I'm also starting a insider membership program. The button is below if you want to see what that's about. I'm going to have some exclusive videos and live streams starting soon. And yeah, that's about all I got. If you haven't liked or subscribed, you can do that. Hit the bell for notifications, all that stuff. Have a good day. Take care.